Hello everyone, this is Dr. Jeku from marriagecrisis.com and here is my website www.marriagecrisis.com. First page I display some information about me. Under the title About, you can see photo and some background information. Today's tutorial is about remarriage and it is based on my book with title Defining the New Testament Logio on Divorce and Remarriage in a Pluralistic Context. Something interesting, my book is part of the Vatican's library, and it is a publication of my doctorate I finished with the University of Ljubljana, Slovenia, the Catholic Faculty of Theology, and the conclusions I reached in my book do not agree with the Catholic view on divorce and remarriage. And yet, I was awarded the highest grade and distinction, summa cum laude, for my doctorate. So, it is interesting to consider, and if you want to purchase the book, you can go to this website, my website, or Amazon. Let's now go to remarriage. Mapping remarriage. I use my manager to establish the concept and links between them to represent this tutorial, starting with the definition of marriage. So, marriage is considered related to establishing both personal and social models of relationships. On personal level, we have marriage as a relational model, a framework for companionship, support, and raising children. On social level, we have marriage as an institution, social model for supportive relationships. My definition extends to biblical understanding of marriage, and here I consider Old Testament view, marriage as a covenant, with a beautiful picture of the relationship between God and Israel. New Testament view, marriage as a covenant, with a beautiful picture of the relationship between Christ and the Church. The definition extends to hermeneutical understanding of marriage through the interpretation of the Bible. And here I consider the main Christian traditions, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant, and their agreement that marriage is a covenant, permanent, lifelong institution, intended by God as such. And they disagree in regards to how this institution, how this concept of marriage intended by God is applied in human relationships. And here we have the conditioning of this permanency of marriage. And this is where the traditions, Christian traditions, disagree, and we'll see how. I define marriage through the Protestant theology of marriage and family, which establishes 6 streams, 5 of which refer to nurturing the marriage by the spouses, and 1 to resolving the marriage crisis. Marriage is a covenant, as I mentioned, and here we have the 6 streams, starting with the mutual companionship. Mutual companionship involves moral, spiritual, emotional, physical, intellectual, and social parts. Morally, it refers to the commitment of the spouses to moral obligations. Spiritually, to their spiritual responsibilities. Emotionally, it refers to provision of romance. Physically, to the commitment of spouses to intimacy. Intellectually, it's about meeting the intellectual needs of the spouses. And socially, it's about provision for meeting their social needs. Next part of the covenant is spouse's character. Here we refer to 4 virtues: honesty, trust, openness, and acceptance. Honesty is about the truth. Spouses are truthful to each other. Trust is about fidelity. Spouses are faithful to each other. Openness is referring to the sharing on daily basis between the spouses. And finally, acceptance is about the unconditional love with acceptance, forgiveness, and repentance of the spouses towards each other. Next element of the covenant is Christian faith. And here we have the spiritual and religious commitment of the spouses towards each other through mutual provision of encouragement, support, and help, towards the family, Here we have the spiritual investment into each other's life in the life of their children towards other Christians, and here we have the participation in the larger Christian community. And towards community, it's about altruistic social impact. Next part of the covenant is about moral framework. And here we have 4 parts: love, justice, freedom, and order. And in terms of love, we're talking about the unconditional love, which highlights the fulfillment of moral obligations. Justice is about the egalitarian model of marriage, where we have the provision of freedom for both spouses' choices and desires. Freedom is about the empowerment of the spouses to fulfill their personal goals, and order is about stability, as well as flexibility in light of change. Finally, we speak about boundaries, and here we have 2 elements. First, boundaries are to be mutually agreed between the spouses, and second, they have to be functional. So there is an element of negotiation and adaptation in light of change. So, the 6th element about marriage crisis we'll cover later, but let's now consider Christian views on divorce and remarriage. And here we have the first one, where both of these are illegitimate. This is the Catholic view, and Catholic understanding of marriage is that has a sacramental nature and as such is indissoluble. Therefore, both divorce and remarriage are legitimate. Next view, some Protestant scholars consider marriage as a covenant kinship union. Therefore, only divorce is legitimate and allowed, but remarriage is prohibited. The next view, again, we have some Protestant scholars who consider that yes, marriage is a permanent covenantal relationship, but because of the fallen human nature, divorce and remarriage are allowed for any reason, but they are both wrong. Next view is also some of the Protestant scholars consider that only Matthew's exception clause and Pauline privilege, Pauline exception, are the grounds for legitimate divorce and remarriage. We'll talk more about this too later. The next view is the Orthodox Church view, which considers marriage as a lifelong sacramental institution. But because of the sinful human nature, there is a resolution of marriage crisis through divorce and remarriage on particular grounds, and these grounds are adultery, permanent insanity, desertion, forcing the spouse into prostitution, and endangering the life of the spouse. And finally, we have the view of marriage as a covenantal relationship and divorce and remarriage allowed on the grounds of violation of the marriage covenant stipulations. And here, because of that violation, we have the innocent party being allowed to divorce and remarry legitimately. And in more depth, this can be explored in my book. Now, let's consider the social challenges of marriage. And as I mentioned, marriage is an institution, and in society, we have dynamics which are trying to deinstitutionalize marriage. And so, what are these dynamics? First of all, we have consumerism. And consumerism is about quality and value satisfaction. So, if the spouse is not satisfied with the other spouse, the spouse is looking for a new one. Then we have separation, an easy approach to divorce and remarriage, once again linked with consumerism also, and other dynamics. We have the phenomenon called serial monogamy, multiple divorces and remarriages. Cohabitation, we have the lack of the legal supportive framework of marriage. Contraceptives and their positive role in marriage, planning for children, and negative role outside of marriage, exploring sexual desires. Then we have abortion and illegitimacy, and here the child is not provided with the relevant framework of marriage. Then we have the sexual revolution, and this has started a long time ago and yet still developing in exploration sexual desires outside of marriage. Finally, we have the homosexuality, which undermines marriage as an union of opposite gender and environment for procreation. We're moving further to domestic challenges, and here we have the failure in understanding marital relationship as covenant. And the domestic challenges consist of several elements covering physical abuse, like violence against the spouse, moving further to emotional abuse, using emotional means against the spouse, sexual abuse, non-verbal, verbal, physical, and other against the spouse, economic control or abuse, material mistreatment of the spouse here, and finally spiritual abuse, misuse of religion and spirituality against the spouse. So these are the challenges. And finally, we consider marital crisis. And so here, remember that I mentioned the sixth stream, and this is the marital crisis is part of the marriage as covenant. Now, three elements I consider here of marital crisis. First, once again, we need to review the understanding of marriage as a covenant, lifelong permanent union. And here we consider the creation account. Very important. In Genesis 2:21 and 24, we see how diversity of genders comes into unity of one flesh in marriage. And language used here, living and cleaving, is also a covenantal language. And this teaching of marriage from the creation account becomes very important for Jesus' teaching on the subject. Next, we have the covenant stipulations, food, cloth, and love. In Exodus 21:10-11, we have the law of the slave wife. And this law defines the obligation of the husband for provision of food, clothes, and conjugal rights in spite of the appearance of the second wife. If this provision is not materialized, we have violation of covenant stipulations, and the slave wife is free from the marriage as well as from the slavery. Further, we are going to the New Testament, and here we explore covenant obligations in the passage of Ephesians 5:25-33, a very important passage for all Christian traditions. And here we have the concept of care based on an example of how man loves his own body and takes care of it by feeding it and clothing it. Also, we have the emphasis of the importance of love in the covenant relationship. And you see the resemblance with the previous law from the Old Testament. Here also we have the example of that relationship expressing the relationship between Christ and the church. Next part of the marital crisis is very important. It's about reconciliation. Here we go to Paul, 1 Corinthians 7:11, where we see how he implements Jesus' teaching of the permanency of marriage in his own context. And the context here is about misunderstanding of the marriage permanency in the culture and society of Paul. His emphasis is on reconciliation. That's the goal of maintaining the marriage covenant in marital crisis through reconciliation. Finally, we reach the breakdown. All the means are exhausted, and the marriage falls apart. Here we have violation of covenant stipulations. And now in the Old Testament, we have an example of that in Hosea 2:2, where Yahweh God divorces Israel due to violations of the covenant, and he provides Israel with divorce certificate, which legitimizes the divorce. And here we have the follow-up. Yahweh remarries a new bride, and the new bride is the united nation between Israel and Judah. In Jeremiah 31 and Hosea 2, we see this picture of depicted in very bright terms. We have a new marriage, a remarriage between Yahweh and the nation of Israel and Judah. In the New Testament, Jesus' teaching emphasizes permanency in Mark 10, 2-12 and Luke 16, 18. And here we have the challenge of the Pharisees with the Deuteronomy 24, 1-4 about the legality of divorce, and Jesus interpreting this passage from the law through the account of Genesis, which we mentioned before, chapter 2, where we see the marriage and its importance in regards to the unity of the genders in one flesh, and some other important dynamics which Jesus uses to interpret Deuteronomy 24 and establish this permanency of the marriage. What we have next is Matthew using Jesus' teaching on marriage and interpreting it in its own context, in its own audience, which has predominantly Jewish character. And here we see the exception clause of sexual misconduct, which establishes the grounds for divorce legitimately and the grounds for legitimate remarriage. And next we also see Paul using Jesus' teaching on the permanency of marriage and interpreting it in its own context, where we have the marriage between the believer and unbeliever. And in that context, we see the departure of the unbeliever who is not interested to maintain the marriage. And this desertion establishes the legitimate grounds for divorce and remarriage of the innocent party, of the believer. So, this is the tutorial on remarriage, covering marriage, covering divorce, and covering remarriage, understanding the challenges, understanding the different views, and understanding the importance of the covenant relationship of marriage, its understanding and application in light of marriage crisis. Thank you for your attention. I'll see you again in the next tutorial. Bye.